Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. On the outskirts of a small town called Rivertown, there was an old house that had been vacant for years. Local residents told stories about the house, claiming that it was haunted and that no one should go near it. Rumor had it that there was a locked room where terrible things had happened. But these stories were exactly what attracted the curious and thrill-seekers to the place. I'm João, a young architect fascinated by ancient buildings and the secrets they could hold. My wife Laura and I decided to move to Rivertown in search of a fresh start. We found the house abandoned, and despite warnings from the residents, we decided to buy it. The idea of restoring the house and discovering its secrets was irresistible to me. Laura was hesitant, but eventually gave in to my enthusiasm. On the day of the move, the weather was cloudy, and a light drizzle was falling, making the atmosphere even more gloomy. As we unloaded the boxes, the neighbors watched us with suspicious eyes. An elderly man approached and warned us about the locked room. "You'd better not try to open that door. Leave the past alone," he said before walking away. I shrugged and smiled at Laura. "They're just stories, love. Let's make this place our home." She smiled back, but I could see the concern in her eyes. In the first few days, the renovation went well. We painted the walls, changed the floors, and cleaned every corner of the house. However, there was a room on the upper floor that remained locked. The door was old and sturdy, and none of the keys we found in the house would open it. Curiosity consumed me, and I was determined to find out what was inside. One night, while Laura was sleeping, I decided to try opening the door again. I used every tool I had, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I sat on the floor and looked at the door, feeling a strange presence. That's when I heard a light whisper, almost inaudible, coming from inside the room. "Help me." The voice was weak but clear. My heart raced, and I ran back to the room, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. However, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. With each creak, my fear increased. In the following days, strange events intensified. Objects began to move on their own. Doors slammed for no reason, and shadows moved on the walls. Laura was getting more and more scared, and I didn't know how to explain what was happening. "John, I think we should sell this house and leave. Something is very wrong here," said Laura, her voice shaking. "We can't give up now, Laura. We need to find out what's going on. Maybe there's a rational explanation for all this," I replied, trying to remain calm. We decided to investigate the history of the house and found old records in the town library. We discovered that the house belonged to a wealthy family who mysteriously disappeared decades ago. There were rumors that they performed macabre rituals in the locked room and that their souls were still trapped there. We returned home with more questions than answers. I decided I needed to open the room anyway. That night, while Laura was in the kitchen, I picked up a sledgehammer and started banging on the door. The sound echoed through the house, and I felt an increasingly oppressive presence around me. With one last blow, the door finally gave way. The room was dark and dusty, with old furniture covered in white sheets. In the center of the room, there was an altar with unlit candles and strange symbols drawn on the floor. I felt a chill when I realized that the atmosphere was freezing, even with the heat outside. Laura entered the room and was horrified by what she saw. "John, we need to get out of here now," she shouted, but before we could leave, the door slammed shut, locking us inside. The candles lit themselves, and a shadowy figure appeared before us. He was a tall man with empty eyes and an expression of pure hatred. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure began to approach, and I felt a biting cold pass through my body. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "I am the guardian of this place. You have awakened forces that should not be disturbed," he replied, raising a skeletal hand. The shadows around us began to move, forming grotesque and distorted figures. Laura started crying, and I hugged her, trying to protect her. "Please let us go. We didn't want to cause any trouble," I pleaded. The figure laughed, a cold, sinister laugh. "Do you think you can just leave? The souls that are trapped here will not find peace until the ritual is completed. You will be the next sacrifices." In desperation, I remembered the diary we found in the library. I picked it up and started reciting the incantations that were written there, hoping that they would work. The shadows retreated slightly, but the figure seemed immune. "It will not work. The power of the ritual is very strong," he said, advancing on us. Laura and I continued to recite the incantations, our voices shaking with fear. It was then that I heard a familiar sound, the sound of a violin. I looked around and saw a violin in a corner of the room covered in dust. I picked up the instrument and started playing a sad, desperate melody. The figure retreated, screaming in pain, and the shadows began to dissipate. "Keep playing, João," shouted Laura. I played with more fervor, feeling the energy around us shift. The figure fell to its knees, its expression of hatred turning to despair. "You cannot defeat the ritual," he said before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. The candles went out and the door opened, letting us out of the room. We ran out of the house, panting and terrified. We looked back and saw the house, now silent, but we knew that the evil had not been completely defeated. Laura and I decided to leave Rivertown and never return. The feeling of oppression still followed us, and we knew we needed help to deal with what we had faced. We found an expert in paranormal phenomena who helped us understand what had happened. "You have awakened ancient and dangerous forces. The ritual is still incomplete, and the souls are still trapped there," he said. "We need to complete the ritual and free the souls once and for all." With the help of the specialist, we returned to the house to perform the final ritual. The atmosphere was heavier than ever, and we knew we were risking our lives. We combined our forces and began the ritual, reciting the incantations and playing the violin. The shadows appeared again, but this time we were prepared. The specialist guided us, and we felt the energy of the ritual increasing. The shadowy figure appeared, but we did not retreat. We continued the ritual, even when he tried to attack us. In the final moment, an intense light filled the room, and we felt the souls being freed. The figure screamed in agony before disappearing forever. Silence took over the house, and we felt a peace we had never experienced. We left the house, exhausted but relieved. We knew that evil had been defeated, but the scars of that encounter would remain forever. Rivertown could finally rest in peace, but we knew our battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. As we walked away from the house, I heard one last whisper in the wind. "We will meet again." And I knew I was just getting started. Months have passed since our last visit to Rivertown. The feeling of oppression had lessened, but the emotional scars were still present. We tried to live a normal life at my parents' house, but something always seemed out of place. Pedro still had frequent nightmares, and Laura and I couldn't forget the horrors we faced. It was then that, on a stormy night, everything culminated in a climax of terror that we could never have predicted. It was a dark and rainy night. The storm was raging outside, and the lights flickered from time to time. Pedro was already in bed, and Laura and I were in the living room trying to relax with a movie. Suddenly, the television turned off by itself, and all the lights in the house went out, leaving us in total darkness. Laura held my hand, and I could feel scared of her. "John, it's happening again," she whispered, her voice shaking. I grabbed a flashlight and started climbing the stairs, going to check on Pedro. The hallway was cold and oppressive, and every step I took seemed to echo endlessly. I arrived at Pedro's room and found the door ajar. Entering, I saw Pedro sitting on the bed, staring at the window. "Daddy, they're here," he said without looking away. A shadow moved outside the window, even though the storm was raging outside. I felt a shiver run down my spine and I pulled Pedro into my arms. "Laura, come quickly," I shouted, trying to stay calm. Laura ran over to us, and the shadow outside moved closer to the window, taking on a more defined shape. It was the shadowy figure that had haunted us since Rivertown. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and I felt an oppressive presence fill the room. "Do you think you can escape me?" the figure whispered, his voice echoing in our minds. Suddenly the window exploded, and the figure entered the room, bringing with it a wave of biting cold. Pedro screamed, and Laura tried to protect him while I placed myself between them and the entity. I picked up the violin and began to play desperately, but the figure seemed stronger than ever. "That won't work this time," the figure said, advancing slowly. Shadows began to form around us, surrounding us. Desperately, I remembered the protective amulets the specialist gave us. I picked them up and began reciting the incantations, my voice shaking with fear. Laura joined me, holding Pedro tightly. The shadows retreated slightly, but the figure continued to advance. "You brought this upon yourself," the figure whispered, reaching a skeletal hand towards me. I felt a searing pain go through my body, as if I was being ripped apart from the inside. The last thing I heard was Laura's scream, before everything went dark. I woke up on the floor of Pedro's room with excruciating pain throughout my body. Laura and Pedro were passed out next to me. The shadowy figure was gone, but the room was destroyed, and the feeling of oppression was still present. I got up with difficulty, helping Laura and Pedro to get up too. "We need to get out of here," Laura said, her voice weak. I agreed, and together we left the house, heading to the car. As I drove through the storm, fear still consumed me. What else could happen? We arrived at the nearest hotel and settled into a room, trying to calm down and understand what had happened. That night, while Laura and Pedro slept, I went to the balcony of the hotel room. I looked at the storm outside, trying to find an answer. It was then that I saw the shadowy figure in the street, looking directly at me. I felt an icy chill run through my body. "You will never be safe," the figure whispered, his voice echoing on the wind. I decided I needed definitive answers. I called the paranormal expert and told him everything that had happened. "This is more serious than we thought. We must act quickly," he said, promising to come immediately. When the specialist arrived, he set up a protective circle in the hotel room and began preparing a final ritual to banish the entity once and for all. "This will be dangerous, but it's our only chance," he said, looking straight into my eyes. Laura and Pedro were by my side, and together we began the ritual. The specialist recited incantations, and I played the violin with all my might. The energy in the room was palpable, and shadows began to form again. The shadowy figure appeared in the center of the circle, screaming in hatred and pain. "You can't defeat me," she shouted, trying to break through the protective circle. The specialist intensified the enchantments and the figure began to fall apart, but it fought with all its strength. I felt unbearable pain, but I continued playing the violin, knowing that we couldn't stop now. With one last scream of agony, the figure exploded in a cloud of black smoke and light filled the room. We felt the evil energy being expelled, and silence took over. The specialist fell to his knees, exhausted but smiling. "We did it," he said, his voice weak. We helped the specialist to his feet, and we finally felt a peace we had never experienced before. We knew that evil had been defeated, but the emotional scars would remain forever. As we left the hotel, I heard one last whisper in the wind, faint but still present. "We will meet again, John." And I knew that although we had achieved a victory, the true terror would never completely disappear. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. On the outskirts of a quiet town where everyone knows everyone and life stories are intertwined in a web of everyday life, there is an old building with a peeling facade and windows that seem to reflect dark secrets. For Clara and João, newlyweds looking for a new beginning, apartment 12 in that building seemed like a perfect opportunity. A peaceful, welcoming place far from the urban hustle and bustle. However, they would soon realize that the tranquility was just a mask for something much more sinister. My name is Clara, and when João and I moved into apartment 12, we were excited at the prospect of building our life together in a place that seemed perfect to us. The building had an aged but charming appearance. The stairs creaked beneath our feet and the smell of old wood filled the air. Despite that, there was something comforting about it all. Something that made us feel like this would be our home. In the first few days, we noticed something strange. Our upstairs neighbor, a man called Mr. Almeida, never left the house. We heard heavy footsteps during the day, but at night it was completely quiet. It was as if he just disappeared. João, always rational, said that he probably had a different lifestyle, but I felt a growing discomfort. One night, while preparing dinner, I heard a strange sound coming from upstairs. There was a continuous dragging, as if someone were moving heavy furniture. I went up to investigate and knocked on Mr. Almeida's door. There was no response, just an oppressive silence. I walked back to our apartment, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Days passed, and the sounds continued. Objects seemed to move on their own. Shadows danced across the walls, and inaudible whispers echoed through the hallways. I started losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching me. João, although worried about my condition, tried to reassure me. I decided to talk to Dona Maria, an elderly woman who lived on the ground floor and knew everyone's story in the building. When I mentioned Mr. Almeida, she was visibly upset. Clara, Mr. Almeida passed away more than 6 months ago. He lived here for decades, but since his death, no one has come up to that apartment, she said, her voice shaking. My heart froze. If Mr. Almeida was dead, who was upstairs? I returned to our apartment with my mind spinning. The nights became unbearable. The sounds intensified, and I began to see a pale, indistinct figure in the shadows of our room. One morning, I woke up to a loud screeching sound. I ran into the living room and found João standing there, pale, staring at the ceiling. A dark stain slowly spread across the plaster, forming macabre patterns. We decided we needed to find out what was going on. Armed with flashlights, we went up to Mr. Almeida's apartment. The door was unlocked. We walked in and were greeted by a musty, decaying smell. The apartment was dusty, full of furniture covered in sheets. In the center of the room, a violin rested on a chair, as if someone had just left it there. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I picked up the violin and felt a strange energy emanate from it. As we explored the apartment, we found an old diary in a drawer. It belonged to Mr. Almeida. The last few entries talked about a presence that haunted him, a figure he saw in the shadows. He mentioned strange rituals he performed with the violin in hopes of appeasing the spirit, but which only seemed to make the situation worse. Suddenly, we heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the next room. We went there, and the indistinct figure of a pale man was standing in the corner, watching us with empty eyes. João screamed, and the figure disappeared, leaving a trail of intense cold. Desperate, we began to read the diary aloud, hoping that Mr. Almeida's words would help us. We discovered that the violin was the key to everything. It had been used in a ritual that trapped the spirit in the apartment. We needed to undo the ritual to free the spirit and free ourselves from the haunting. We returned to our apartment with the violin and the diary. At night, I followed the instructions in the diary, playing the melody that Mr. Almeida had described. With each note, the feeling of oppression increased, and the shadows around us seemed to stir. Suddenly, the pale man's figure appeared again, but this time it was more defined, more real. He charged towards us, and the air around us turned freezing cold. I continued playing, my hands shaking with fear. João held my free hand, trying to give me courage. The figure screamed, a sound that seemed to tear apart reality itself. The walls shook, and the violin vibrated intensely in my hands. With one last effort, I played the last note of the melody. The figure writhed, its form crumbling into a cloud of shadows that dissipated into the air. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat on the floor, exhausted and shaken, but relieved. We knew the spirit had been freed, but the experience left us scarred forever. We decided to move away from there, looking for a new beginning away from that haunted place. While we were packing our things, I found a letter hidden between the pages of Mr. Almeida's diary. It was a farewell, written to someone he loved. He asked for forgiveness for the mistakes he had made and hoped that one day he would find peace. I took the letter with me, as a reminder of what we had experienced. We left the next morning, leaving behind the old building and its dark stories, but the feeling that something was still watching us never left me. I knew that somewhere in the shadows, the secrets of the past continued to lurk, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Our new home was more modern and bright, a welcome contrast to the dreary surroundings we left behind. However, no matter how hard we tried, we could not completely rid ourselves of the memories of our experience. The nights were still haunted by nightmares and inaudible whispers, echoing in the depths of our minds. One afternoon, while unpacking some boxes, I found the violin that I had brought from Mr. Almeida's apartment. My first reaction was to throw it away, but something stopped me. I decided to keep it in the attic, away from our daily interactions. Maybe there, among boxes of past memories, he couldn't affect us. Time passed, and we slowly began to feel more comfortable in our new home. I made new friends in the neighborhood and started getting involved in community activities, trying to rebuild the normality that had been broken. João and I rarely spoke about what had happened, preferring to bury those memories in the back of our minds. Yet no matter how hard we tried to forget, something always pulled us back. One night during dinner with our new friends, one of the neighbors mentioned hearing classical music coming from our house. João and I exchanged worried looks. We knew we hadn't played any music. After the guests left, we hesitantly went up to the attic. The violin was there, right where we left it, but there was something different in the air. The environment was colder, and a feeling of oppression settled in. I picked up the violin, and as I played it, a dark, melancholy melody filled the air. It was then that I realized the spirit we freed had not completely disappeared. It was connected to the violin, using it as a portal to manifest. I looked at João, who looked as scared as me. We knew we needed to do something, but what? That night, we read Mr. Almeida's diary again, looking for clues we might have missed. We discovered a passage that mentioned an ancient banishing ritual, something more powerful than what we had tried before. We decided this was our only chance to get rid of the spirit once and for all. We prepared everything as described in the diary. We lit candles around the violin and began to recite the words of the ritual. With each verse, the feeling of oppression increased, and shadows began to form around us. The violin vibrated intensely, emitting strange and disturbing sounds. Suddenly, the pale man's figure appeared again, more terrifying than ever. His presence was overwhelming, and his expression of hatred and pain was almost unbearable. I continued reciting the ritual, my voice shaking as João approached me, trying to remain calm. The shadows around us began to contort, taking on grotesque and threatening shapes. They seemed alive, moving as if they had a mind of their own. The air grew thick and cold, and the candlelight flickered, almost extinguished. The pale man's figure slowly advanced, his empty eyes fixed on me. "You can't banish me," he whispered, his voice an echo of desperation and anger. "I'm part of this place now, part of you." His words resonated in my mind, heightening my terror. I continued reciting the ritual, trying to ignore the fear that consumed me. The violin made a high-pitched sound, almost like a scream, and I felt a wave of negative energy emanate from it. Suddenly, the shadows cast themselves over us, their distorted shapes trying to envelop us. John screamed, trying to push them away, but they seemed endless. The pale man's figure moved even closer, and I felt his cold touch on my skin. It was as if death itself were touching me. I fought back the panic and continued to recite the ritual, my voice growing louder and more desperate. The pale man's figure began to contort, his face distorting into a mask of agony. The shadows around us also began to tremble, as if they were being repelled by the force of the ritual. With one last effort, I recited the final words of the ritual, my voice echoing through the attic. The candle light flared brightly, and the shadows screamed in unison. The pale man's figure screamed, his body disintegrating into a cloud of darkness that was sucked into the violin. The violin fell to the floor with a hollow sound, and the silence that followed was deafening. The air around us returned to normal, and the shadows disappeared. We sat on the ground, exhausted and shaken, but alive. We knew the spirit had been banished, but the experience had left us scarred forever. We decided we needed to get rid of the violin once and for all. We grabbed the violin and drove out of the house, driving to a nearby river. We threw the violin into the water, watching as it slowly sank. We felt a sense of relief, as if we were finally free of the evil that had haunted us. We drove home, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The nights were still difficult, and the nightmares still haunted us, but we knew we had faced something truly terrible and survived. The story of the silent neighbor and the haunted violin would forever be etched in our memory, a constant reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places. However, as the days passed, we began to realize that something was still wrong. Small, disturbing events continued to occur. Objects moved on their own, shadows danced on the walls, and inaudible whispers still echoed through the house. It seemed that the evil we had fought had not been completely defeated. One night I awoke to a strange sound coming from the attic. I climbed the stairs, feeling a chill run down my spine. When I opened the door, I found the violin, dry and intact, lying on the floor, as if it had never been thrown into the river. The feeling of terror returned with full force, and I realized that our fight against evil was far from over. We knew that we had to find a definitive way to rid ourselves of the violin and the spirit it carried. We searched tirelessly, searching for answers in ancient books and consulting occult experts. Finally, we discovered an ancient ritual of destruction that could end the evil once and for all. We prepared to perform the ritual, knowing that it would be our last chance at deliverance. We lit candles around the violin and began to recite the ancient words. The air around us grew heavy, and the feeling of oppression grew. The pale man's figure appeared again, more menacing than ever. "You will never escape me," he whispered, his voice an echo of despair and rage. "I am part of you." With renewed determination, I continued to recite the ritual, my voice growing in intensity. The shadows around us stirred violently, and the violin emitted a high-pitched sound, almost like a scream of agony. The pale man's figure began to contort, his face distorting into a mask of suffering. Suddenly, the violin began to crack, emitting an intense light. The pale man's figure screamed, and his body began to disintegrate into a cloud of darkness. The shadows around us also began to disappear, being sucked into the violin. With one last effort, I recited the final words of the ritual, my voice echoing through the attic. The violin exploded in a cloud of ash, and the silence that followed was deafening. We knew that the spirit had been banished once and for all, and the feeling of oppression had completely disappeared. We sat on the floor, exhausted but relieved, knowing that we were finally free of the evil that haunted us. The house was once again a place of peace, and the nights became quiet again. The story of the silent neighbor and the haunted violin would forever be etched in our memories, a constant reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places. As we packed our things to leave the building, I looked back one last time. I knew that the peace we had achieved was fragile, and that evil could resurface at any moment. But she was ready to face any challenge that came her way, with the courage and determination to never give up on the light, even on the darkest nights. Deep on an isolated hill, where mist creeps through the trees and winds howl like ancient laments, lies an abandoned Victorian house. The mansion, with its ivy-covered walls and broken windows, hides dark secrets from a past that many would prefer to forget. This is the story of a young couple who, seeking adventure and renewal, found more than they bargained for when trying to bring life back to Casa da Colina. My name is Rafael, and this is the story that changed my life forever. When my wife, Clara, and I decided to buy the old house on the hill, we were looking for a project that would challenge us and give us a new perspective on life. The Victorian mansion, with its stately architecture and once magnificent gardens, seemed like the perfect place for our new bed and breakfast. Little did we know what awaited us within those decrepit walls. From day one, the atmosphere around the house felt heavy, as if the land itself was saturated with untold secrets. The air was cold and damp, even on the hottest days, and an oppressive silence hung in the room. Clara and I threw ourselves into the renovations, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort that seemed to increase every day. We started in the gardens, cleaning up the dry leaves and cutting down the ivy that covered the windows. It was then that we found the first clue that something was wrong. In the middle of the garden, we discovered a small angel statue covered in moss and almost buried. His empty eyes seemed to follow us as we worked. Clara thought it was a charming relic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister in that look. The nights were even more disturbing. The wind was blowing hard, making the trees creak as if they were alive. Sometimes we woke up to inexplicable sounds coming from downstairs. Heavy footsteps, indistinct whispers, and once, the sound of a soft violin melody. We decided to explore the house further, hoping to find some explanation. We discovered a hidden basement, the entrance to which was covered by an old bookcase. We forced our way inside and descended the creaky stairs, lit only by the dim lights of our flashlights. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. Deep in the basement, we found a secret room, with walls covered in dark wood and a single window covered in boards. In the center of the room, there was a wooden table with a series of old documents and yellowed photos. Clara took one of the documents and started reading it out loud. It was a diary written by a doctor who had lived in the house in the 1920s. The diary entries described cruel experiments and inhumane treatments carried out on mental patients. The doctor, obsessed with finding a cure for mental illnesses, carried out his experiments in secret, away from the eyes of society. The photos showed faces of pain and despair, patients tied to beds and restraint chairs. We felt a chill run through our bodies as we looked at those disturbing images. It was then that I heard a sound coming from the corner of the room, a light scratching, almost imperceptible. I pointed the flashlight in that direction and saw a shadow moving quickly. Panic took over us. We ran up the stairs, trying to leave the basement behind. When we reached the surface, we closed the cellar door and pushed the bookcase back into place. Clara was pale, and I knew we needed to get out of there, at least for that night. We decided to spend the night in the city, in a hotel, to try to process what we had discovered. I told everything to the hotel manager, an older man called Senor Almeida, who seemed to know the history of the house well. He told us that the mansion had been avoided for decades due to rumors that it was haunted by the souls of patients who died in the doctor's experiments. Despite our fear, we knew we couldn't just abandon the house. It was our dream to turn it into a guest house, and we were determined to move forward. We returned the next day, armed with more flashlights and the determination to face whatever came our way. As we continued the renovations, the disturbing events intensified. Objects moved on their own. Doors opened and closed with force, and whispers echoed through the empty hallways. Clara and I began to fight more frequently, the tension affecting us deeply. She wanted to call a medium or a priest to bless the house, but I resisted, still trying to rationalize what was happening. One night, Clara woke up screaming. I ran into the bedroom and found her standing, staring at the mirror. Her eyes were filled with terror. "I saw someone in the mirror," she said, trembling. "A woman with empty eyes, watching me." I tried to calm her down, but I knew we needed to do something. We decided to invite Senor Almeida to visit the house and help us understand more about its past. He brought with him some old documents and told us more about the doctor, Dr. Frederico, who had transformed the house into a private asylum for his experiments. We discovered that Frederico had a wife, Isabella, who died mysteriously. Some said she was one of the victims of his experiments. As Senor Almeida told us these stories, the atmosphere around us seemed to become heavier. I heard a scratching sound coming from the kitchen and went to investigate. The sight left me in shock. The table was covered in deep scratches, as if someone had desperately tried to write something on the wood. The words, "Help me," were engraved on the surface. Fear took over me. But I knew we couldn't continue ignoring the signs. Clara and I decided to hold a seance, hoping to communicate with the souls that haunted the house. We summoned a medium, Donna Helena, who came to the mansion the following night. Donna Helena, a woman with an imposing presence and penetrating eyes, prepared the living room for the session. We lit candles around a round table and sat hand in hand. The atmosphere was tense, and the silence was only broken by the crackling of candles. Donna Helena began to invoke the spirits, her voice low and firm. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and a cold breeze blew past us. I felt a chill go up my spine and I squeezed Clara's hand. It was then that we heard a whisper, a female voice, soft but full of pain. "Help me," said the voice, and the candles flickered. Donna Helena went into a trance and began to speak, but her voice was different, as if someone else was using her body. "I am Isabella," she said. "My husband imprisoned me here. He did terrible things to me. Please free my soul." The pain in Isabella's voice was palpable, and tears ran down Clara's face. The session was interrupted by a loud bang. One of the windows opened with force, and a gust of wind blew out the candles. The room was left in complete darkness, and panic took over us. Donna Helena came to her senses and told us that we needed to find Isabella's remains to free her soul. Determined to help, we began investigating the house further. We found a hidden trapdoor in the basement, which led to an underground tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and dark, and the air was almost unbreathable. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the pedestrian walls. At the end of the tunnel, we found a small chamber where there was a wooden coffin. Upon opening the coffin, we found Isabella's remains along with an old violin. I picked up the violin, and as I played it, I felt a presence around me. Clara and I performed a purification ritual, burning herbs and reciting prayers, hoping to free Isabella's soul. When we finished, the feeling of oppression began to ease, and a gentle breeze passed through the chamber. I felt an inexplicable peace, as if we had finally done the right thing. We returned to the surface, exhausted but relieved. Over the next few days, the house looked different. The heavy atmosphere had dissipated, and the disturbing events had stopped. Clara and I continued the renovations, and the mansion began to come to life again. We transformed the place into a welcoming guest house, where guests could enjoy the beauty of the house and gardens. In the days that followed, Clara and I began to feel safer at Casa da Colina. The oppressive presence that once permeated every corner had diminished, and the mansion seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. However, a persistent restlessness accompanied me, as if something dark was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One night, while Clara and I were in the living room enjoying a peaceful evening, we heard a sound that chilled our bones. A violin playing a sad, melancholy melody. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the house, but we knew there was no violin there. We stood up slowly, our hearts beating fast, and followed the sound that echoed through the hallways. The sound took us to the basement, where we had discovered the hidden room with the children's toys. The cellar door was ajar and a faint light was escaping through the cracks. I went down the stairs first, with Clara right behind me, and what we found there left us petrified. In the center of the hidden room, where before there were only old toys and strange symbols, was a man playing the violin. He had an ethereal, almost translucent appearance, and his face was contorted in an expression of profound sadness. I recognized him immediately from the descriptions in the documents. It was Dr. Federico. Terror washed over me as I realized he was not alone. The children we had freed were there too, but they looked different now. Their eyes were empty and their expressions were desolate. They moved strangely like puppets under the control of Federico's violin. "Why have you come back?" I whispered, more to myself than to Clara. Federico looked up at us, and his expression of sadness turned into a mask of anger. "Did you think you could defeat me so easily? I have never left this place. My souls have never found peace," he said, his voice echoing ominously around the room. Clara squeezed my hand, and I could feel the growing fear in her eyes. We had to do something, but we were paralyzed by Federico's evil presence. He began to play the violin more intensely, and the children moved towards us, their footsteps echoing across the floor. I felt absolute despair take hold of me, but I knew we couldn't give up. I took Clara's hand and began to recite the words of the ritual that Donna Helena had taught us. The atmosphere grew heavier, and Federico screamed in rage, trying to silence us. Suddenly, an invisible force threw me against the wall, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body. Clara tried to continue the ritual alone, but the children surrounded her, preventing her from moving. Federico advanced, his violin producing an agonizing sound that seemed to tear at our souls. It was then that an unexpected figure appeared. Donna Helena. She entered the basement with unwavering determination and began to recite the ritual with an authority we had never seen before. Her voice cut through the heavy atmosphere like a blade, and the children began to back away. Federico screamed, his body contorting in agony. "No, this can't end like this," he roared, but his figure began to disintegrate under the power of the ritual. The children, now freed, disappeared one by one, their expressions of pain turning to peace. When Federico finally disappeared, absolute silence filled the basement. The oppressive atmosphere had disappeared, replaced by a sense of profound relief. Donna Helena approached us, exhausted but with a look of triumph. "He can no longer haunt us," she said, her voice shaking. "The children's souls are finally free." We returned to the living room, where we sat in silence trying to process what had happened. Clara and I were exhausted, but we felt that the real battle was over. Hill House was finally at peace. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed into a place of light and hope. Renovations continued, and soon the house was ready to receive guests. We turned the place into a bed and breakfast, sharing the house's history with those who came to visit. Clara and I found new purpose, helping others find peace and redemption. But we knew that the darkness never completely disappears. Whenever we heard a strange sound or felt an unexpected chill, we remembered Dr. Federico and the souls he tried to imprison. Hill House was a testament to our courage, but also a constant reminder that evil can arise in the most unexpected places. And so our story continues, marked by victory over the shadows and constant vigilance. We know that true peace is still just out of reach, and the darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always lurking, ready to envelop us once again in its cold, deadly embrace.